Okay, well, I guess we'll start. I just sent out a note that has to do with basically if you're interested in this whole sort of Mahele thing. The most famous book, though it's somewhat hard to find, the library has copies, is this huge thing by Moffat and Fitzpatrick done about 20 years ago. It's actually called Surveying the Mahele. So it's probably your best source for all this. It's got some beautiful maps and stuff in it too, so it's a very easy to read. And I guess I think I mentioned before, Solons's work on Honolulu was the other really good one in looking at the relationship of people and the land and how this changed and who gets advantage out of it and who loses out of it. So two very good, both very consumable works if you want to look at it in more detail. When you're looking at this whole issue, basically then just sort of hop after the Mahele. The Mahele is just a process. So the Mahele is now finished. That pie has been dispersed. The Makana are basically totally disenfranchised from the entire situation. The chiefs have done quite well by virtue of the Mahele. Most importantly, now that the Mahele is done, all the land that wasn't claimed is now put up to auction. And what you find is all the folks that were not members of the Hawaiian nation can now bid on the land. And this is when everything just sort of unravels, just like a ball of string. Because what happens is a few families or a few individuals had actually strategized this entire situation when they knew, from the time they knew the Mahele was going to happen. So they were just waiting and sort of in the wings. And the minute that the Mahele's power on this land is available, they just jump on it and just grab enormous amounts of property. Now you have to remember that if you think of, say, 1820 or 1821, there's sort of three sets of players. There's the chiefs, there's the Euro-Americans that live here, sort of what I'd call the traders and stuff like that. And then the third group that's just coming in would be the missionaries. By the 1850s, that's switched. So by the time the Mahele happens, the three groups are sort of this. On one hand, you still have the chiefs. The individuals have changed. They've become a little more fixed in their logic. But they're still the power force, and they're the power force right into the end of the 19th century. The second group is the Makainana, but especially with the Mahele happening, and even before that, as Solons points out, they're now a group which feels increasingly dislocated both from property and also from the chiefs. The whole system of sort of loyalty and reciprocity is really collapsing. So more and more the Makainana feel themselves entirely sort of lost. They're lost from the land, they're lost from their political, social relationships, and they're just adrift, for lack of a better term, but they're still the majority population. The third group is not the missionaries per se. The missionaries vanish by pretty much 1831. What happens though is many of them stay here. Most of them marry into chiefly families, and it's their kids that have become hugely important because the kids get called the missionary boys. The kids could be defined, and I think I mentioned this before, just to reiterate, it could be defined as what we call kamaina. On one hand, they see their heritage as being from their Adi'i background from one side of the family, usually the mother's side of the background. On the other hand, they see their background being even more strongly from their father's background, which is New England Calvinist. And these are the folks that go to Punahou, which was then called Oahu College. So they're going to Punahou, they're being trained in New England schools. It just happens to be here in Hawaii, and Punahou is still a very New England school. When they're done with their Punahou education, they then almost invariably go back east to New England and go to the same place their dad went to, which was either Dartmouth, Harvard, Yale, I can't remember the other one or two, whatever the 4 or 5 New England universities are. Because most of the missionaries were university trained. So they were very highly educated by the standards of the time, where most people had only like a 4th grade education. So the kids are well educated. They come back when they're, say, 20 years old, just arbitrarily. From the time they were about in 1st grade till age 20, they've been educated in how the American system is the best way. It's the only way. That's the education system they've got. They've been totally inculcated in the Calvinist values, individualism, the whole 9 yards. They've had very little exposure, and oftentimes in a rather derogatory way, to their Hawaiian background. So when these guys come back home, and you have to remember, it's confusing because they're part chiefly families. The Wilcoxes, the Cooks, the Castles, all these folks, the Beckwiths, all these folks are actually part Hawaiian. And so when they come back here, They have a Hawaiian heritage, but they see themselves in a very me first, they're very individualistic and a very for-profit situation because they're not coming back as missionaries. They're coming back with sort of two principles. One, I'm going to make money. I'm going to make lots of money. I'm going to be really successful. So the classic American entrepreneur. The second is that they've been picked up this really strong Calvinist attitude that if you're successful, that becomes the icon. I don't know. It becomes the motivator for other people that aren't successful to follow in your footsteps. So if I become a millionaire and I'm Calvinist, one of my attitudes is not only have I become a millionaire, but other people who are poor should look at me and say, oh, if he can do it, so can I. So I become a example, a motivator for other people to strive harder and be successful. Now you have to remember the Calvinists, that also means that everyone's going to go to heaven because physical, economic success is hard work, da, 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 da. So the missionary boys, the Kamaina, when they come back here, immediately start acquiring huge amounts of property, and they're the group that buys all the land up at the end of the Mahele. Many of them were technically Hawaiian in terms of citizenship, but almost none of them declared land during the Mahele. They waited until it was over. And then they bought land up really, really cheap because the monarchy was just auctioning off land for whatever they could get, because as far as they were concerned, no one wanted it. No one had claimed it. So all of a sudden you end up with these huge estates that really pop overnight. Now, on top of that, they're also using the adverse possession law very, very quickly. And again, you have to remember, these guys are trained in New England universities. They're very much brought up in what eventually becomes called the robber baron syndrome in the United States, where taking advantage of people just means that you're smarter than them. And taking advantage of people really isn't seen that way. It's just seen that, well, if I'm more clever, then I deserve it. If you're less clever and you're dumb enough, then you're a sucker and you should lose it. So on one hand, they have this attitude, they're from Hawaii. On the other hand, this group, almost to a person, has absolutely no compunctions about screwing over their neighbors, and in many cases their relatives, out of land and resources to make themselves more successful. And their mantra would sort of be, well, if I'm successful, then everyone else is going to want to be. If you ever want to see where they live, to go up Nuuanu, go up to Pali. As you're going up to Pali through Nuuanu on either side, you'll see those beautiful, almost stone, other-looking estates. Those estates are actually the old houses of the Kamaina families. The Wilcox house, the Castle house, the Cook house. So when you're looking at those places, you're actually seeing the way they put themselves in the landscape in these very pretty, very white, pillared mansions for the purpose of making envy out of everyone else. But the envy was that everyone else would want to be like them. So on one hand, your neighbors are jealous of you, but that's also going to motivate them to work harder. That's the logic. Now, one of the side effects of this, of course, is since the folks in Maka'anana don't have access to resources and they don't buy the lifestyle, they're not into this whole sort of Calvinist thing, then that provides an excuse to basically dump on them. Because if you're one of these Calvinists and you are successful and you live in a big mansion in Nuuanu, and you've got relatives or friends who are, or people who are Maka'anana and they're not into this, then your attitude is, well, if you're not going to buy into the religion, if you're not going to buy into the morality and the logic, then you're just stupid. And so this becomes one of the first really big anti-Hawaiian stereotypes, or stereotypes of Hawaiians, is that they're lazy, they're this and that and the other thing, which then justifies what you've already done, which is basically steal property. So a lot of the anti-Hawaiian stereotypes that you see generated by the late 19th century and still exist today are generated by folks who have a vested interest in those stereotypes because it makes them feel better about themselves. In dissing on Hawaiians, they legitimize morally and socially the fact that they've intentionally disenfranchised a chunk of the population. Now, what they also do is you have to remember these folks are coming back well educated. And because they are partly chiefs, they become the government by the 1850s, 1860s. So they're running the judiciary, they're running the law system, they're running the finance ministry. So what that means is they're judge and jury for anything that happens. And Moffat's book has got some great examples of people actually going and making land claims, Maka'anana making land claims, especially under adverse possession. The land has been stolen from them. And so they go and they actually spend the money to hire a lawyer, they go to court and they make this claim, so-and-so stole my property, which is what you were supposed to do. The problem is when they go to the court, for example, if they go to court on the west side of this island, the courts were almost invariably, the judge running the court would be one of the Campbell family. The family that stole the property was the Campbell family. So if I'm one of the Makananan, I'm going there and complaining, the judge that's hearing the case has actually got a vested interest in me losing the case because his family's making money out of this. And this was the system we had right in the 1950s. The legal judicial system here was pretty much populated by the Kamai and the missionary boy families, and it worked to their advantage, and everyone else was just reamed. Now, everyone stayed out of the way of the chiefs because you didn't want to make things look bad. Of course, these folks are related to the chiefs, but the Makananan were fair game. And this is one reason why in a lot of the Hawaiian system, if you're especially on the outer islands, where I think you see it a little more, Hawaiians still have a very negative or very leery attitude about the legal system in terms of its being impartial. Because the history here in Hawaii, right through the territorial period, in fact, even in early statehood, was the judiciary never was impartial. And by the 1850s, 1860s, the chiefs have just dropped it. They're not interested in this. I don't know of any chief that was a member of the judiciary from the 1850s on. So the chiefs are just like doing their own thing. And they don't care because they pretty much figure they'll use the legal system for whatever they want. The rest of the population just takes it on the chin. So the end result of this is by the 1860s, which is only, maybe 10 years after the Mahele, you've already got this enormous amount of land held in an incredibly few number of families. And these are the missionary boys. By the 1860s, 1870s, they actually coalesce themselves into five areas. So they actually divide the islands up. The Wilcoxes pretty much run everything on Kauai. The Castle and Cook family pretty much runs most of Oahu, especially the windward and leeward sides. Alexander and Baldwin run almost all of Maui. And then a branch that actually runs Molokai. And then you've got the sort of older system of the ranchers and other stuff on the Big Island, which is a little more, just not quite as organized. But the big players there would be the Parker family, of course. So what you've got is the islands break themselves out in these little sort of enclaves, all under control of very, very few families. If you look at the judiciary, for example, on Maui, you find that almost invariably a member of the Alexander, the Baldwin family is the head of the land courts here, right into the 1930s. So if you were anyone else, you weren't going to get a fair hearing. And everyone knew that. So there was no point in complaining because you knew the system was stacked against you. So this was sort of the way the monarchy and the territorial period was. Now, if you're Makainana, that just means you're out of luck, to put it mildly. But what it also means is these guys now that have all this property are trying to figure, since their big thing is to be successful, they want to make lots of money. The way they're going to do that is by figuring out how to convert property into cash. And the way that you do that is through agriculture. And so initially sugar starts up. Sugar initially is grown here. The Chinese bring it in about 1800. I mean, sugar was here, but you bring in different varieties that you find in Taiwan by early 19th century. And the Chinese are the first ones to start growing sugar here in the sense of growing it commercially. Hawaiians always used it as sort of a medicinal and actually also as a plant that you plant on the side of walls, especially mud embankments to stabilize things. So they didn't really use it very much. The Chinese, of course, use sugar for a lot of stuff, not to mention cooking. So they start growing the sugar here. Very quickly, the traders and merchants realized that you can convert the sugar into rum, which of course is, was the demon rum of the 19th century. And of course, they can sell it for a ton of money to the sailors and the ships. So sugar very quickly becomes the first crop because it has so much, it's so easy to convert to cash. By the 1830s, 1840s, as alcoholism and alcohol consumption gets out of hand, the government sets up a series of laws to basically control alcohol production, much of which was ignored, sort of like prohibition in the 1930s in the US. But by the 1850s, 60s, it's sort of kicking in. And what you get is the other thing that's happening isn't here. The other thing that's happening is the West Coast of the United States. You have to remember the late 1840s, early 1850s is the gold rush in California. So all of a sudden, one, the West Coast is now part of the United States. Secondly, is this enormous increase in population, and it's really insane. A classic example would be the section where we used to have our offices. This little section here of Kauai, the Poipu area. This was one of the areas, the missionary that was running the mission station here intentionally didn't tell the locals about, I think I mentioned before, didn't tell the locals, the Maka'anana, about the mahele. So almost no one claims property. He then claims the property and makes this all into sort of a farm, evicts almost the entire population off of the land, and then keeps it as his private estate. What he then does is, this is now 1853, he very quickly realizes that in California, the gold rush is at its height. And so you can find pictures if you Google San Francisco Bay Gold Rush or Gold Rush San Francisco. And the whole harbor in San Francisco is filled with, I believe, up to 100 ships that are just sitting there. The reason being that what would happen is the ships would bring, gold rush prospectors or people who wanted to get into the gold rush to San Francisco. The ship would land, everyone would get off the ship, but also the crew would leave to go look for gold. So you ended up with ships totally abandoned. The captain, the crew, everyone just gets the hell off the ship and goes to Sacramento area and starts looking for money. So you end up with literally San Francisco Bay looks just like this giant old parking lot full of nothing but boats. And no one in that part of California would actually do anything for money other than look for gold. And to be honest, for the first few years, there was enough gold with a fair little amount of money, a fair amount of effort, you could find gold. So it was really stupid to try to have a regular job when you could make 20 or 50 times as much in a week if you got lucky. So the end result is you end up with this enormous, relatively speaking, population in California who are doing one particular thing. Now that means they're not growing crops, they're not doing anything else, they're just looking for gold, but they still need to eat, they still need this and that. And so what you end up is a sort of ancillary market. The Chinese in California were one of the ones that did the ancillary market. So invariably it's a Chinese market or a Chinese store people are buying stuff from. So the Chinese would cook the food, the Chinese would do the laundry, the Chinese would provide the food, would provide the stuff to eat. And the Howleys, the Americans who are the gold rush guys, would go and dig up the gold and then, take it to the Chinese to trade for the food and stuff they needed to survive so they could look for more gold. Now in a bizarre way, even though this is 2,600 miles from San Francisco, the guys here realized, as with many of the islands, that they obviously weren't going to be in the gold rush directly, but they were contacted very early on to provide food for the gold rush. So this little tiny part of Kauai started madly growing Irish potatoes, which is what you guys think of like holly potatoes. So they grow enormous amounts of potatoes, a few sweet potatoes, and then they're piling this on boats to sail to California. Now the problem is the boats that come back from California are coming back empty. So some genius has the idea of taking people's laundry in California, put it on the boats, bringing it over here. The ladies here wash the laundry. They then throw the laundry in with all the dirty potatoes. You got to figure out how that works. And you sail the whole mess back to California. So for almost 5 years, these guys made money as fast. It was almost like printing money. And the weird thing was they weren't selling a penny of it here in Hawaii. All this stuff was being sold in California during the insanity of the gold rush, in the same way that you did laundry. I believe it was something like $5 for like a big bag of laundry back in 1856 here in Poipu. $5 at that time could buy you a horse or a carriage in California. So people were spending basically the equivalent of what, 5 or 10 grand to have a bag of laundry washed in Hawaii. Not that they cared that it was Hawaii, they just wanted to wash because they were too busy looking for gold. The potatoes went for huge sums of money. So what happened is Hawaii got involved in the California gold rush. And after that, you end up with this relationship right into the early 21st century, that Hawaii is the place where you do things, but you get your money from the banks and investors in California. And likewise, if you're San Francisco or you're California, Hawaii becomes almost like a county in California, that you invest in Hawaii. You spend money in Hawaii. To a certain extent, you eventually become a tourist in Hawaii. Have relatives or people living in Hawaii who are growing crops. The sugar that you grow here in Hawaii, as in Poipu, is then shipped to California to be refined into white sugar, which you then, weirdly enough, ship back to Hawaii to eat as white sugar. So California, and specifically San Francisco and Honolulu in particular, end up in this almost linked symbiotic relationship, that Hawaii and Hawaiian products get inextricably linked to California and California needs. And since California was a lot larger, was a hell of a lot richer, and it was part of the United States, that to the folks in Hawaii, especially these Kama'aina boys, provides you with a perfect market because it's an American market, it's a predictable market, it's a market with God knows how much money, and they want stuff from Hawaii. So to a certain extent, Hawaii becomes the yes people for what California needs. If California needs it and you can do it in Hawaii, they go, oh yeah, we can do that, and bang, it happens. To a certain extent, the pressure to start up tourism right now is pressure from California for Hawaii tourism. So even in the COVID period in 2020, this relationship really hasn't changed much at all. How it plays out in terms of what they're talking about varies, but the relationship has been remarkably stable. So what you find here is when these guys are, when the Kama'aina, the missionary boys are looking for ways to make money, it's not to sell it here. Hawaii has never been a place where the guys that invest money are interested in us as a market. They're interested in the mainland as a market. And in fact, you could see this. You remember when COVID started, it was a while before everyone realized that we actually had farmers here and you could actually buy stuff from here. And there's still that like made in Hawaii, buy in Hawaii thing. And the fact that you have to advertise it is pretty weird when you think about it, except that Hawaii's never been a place where people think of Hawaii as being their main market. It's the mainland or some other place that's the main market. And that's been true since the mid-19th century. First one, sugar. The problem with sugar, you can only grow it in certain types of property. Sugar requires a big investment because you got to have a sugar mill, you got to do all this stuff, and then you're shipping the raw sugar off to California. So you weren't making as much money. Sugar wasn't a very profitable industry. It just had the advantage that as long as you had cheap labor, it was a pretty easy industry to do. It was pretty brain dead simple to grow in sugar here. So it was a real low hanging fruit in terms of, you know, if I want to make some money off of some land. What pops up by the late 19th century, and again, this is largely California or the West Coast in general, is coffee. Americans were already addicted to coffee, not as bad as they are now, but they already were seriously addicted. And so what happens is coffee was being produced in Latin America, especially Central America. But coffee production was having problems. There were insurrections going on, there were political instabilities. Coffee production was pretty iffy in terms of quality. And so what you got was people complaining that the price of coffee was too high, the quality was too low. And people started importing coffee here, just I think probably for their own purposes. And when they started growing it, some of these missionary boys, some of these Kama'aina, realized that coffee grows really, really, really well here. And the coffee was of high quality. So what happens is a lot of these folks who are into sugar start looking in areas in the back of valleys and such where it's more marginal and suddenly go, hey, wait a second. You know, I'm not really using this property I'm not making much money off of this land. If I converted it to coffee production, I could make a hell of a lot more money than I am doing something else. And because coffee is a tree, it won't really require a lot of effort. I just need to hire folks when it's ready to pick, and they'll go back and they pick it. So all of a sudden what you find in the back of all the valleys especially is that people start buying up what had been junk land or was old agricultural land, but no one was using it. And they come up with a second big industry, which is the coffee business. And we're a perfect case in point because let me switch over here. Here's us, here's Palolo. This whole area here was part agriculture, some of it was sugar, but this area already was starting to get people moving in, so it really wasn't, you know, you really couldn't do a lot of sugar. Sugar was like the Eva plant and stuff like that. You needed volume for sugar. And so what happened is this back part of the valley was pretty much depopulated. There were a few people living back there. There was some small farmers back there. This is where a lot of your Maka'aina claims are because the folks that wanted to have these huge estates really couldn't see any value in investing in places like the back part of Palolo because it really wasn't useful. You couldn't grow coffee back there. I mean, you couldn't grow sugar in this area. It's too wet. So all of a sudden when coffee pops up, these same guys that ignored this area start running in here and they just madly started buying up property in places like Palolo, the Pukeli area, the Waiomau area, the back of the valleys, and they plant every single inch in coffee. And the coffee grows and everyone starts making money over coffee and they start making tons of money out of coffee. Back in Manoa Valley, all the valleys suddenly become coffee plantations in the space of less than 3 or 4 years. Because coffee grows really fast here. If you plant coffee in 4 or 5 years, you have a small tree and it's already producing berries. So it really was very little effort and an enormous reward. And because they're trees that are actually growing here, unlike sugar, they didn't need irrigation, they didn't need anything, they just grew here. So you can make a ton of money out of it. So everyone ends up in the coffee business, and that was actually going to replace sugar. If you look at the newspapers and again your thrums, you'll find that coffee becomes the big thing of the 1890s. Everyone's making money out of it. Everyone's investing. People are competing to buy land in Palolo that already has coffee on it because then they'll sell the coffee plantation because someone thinks they can make more. And all of a sudden it's just going absolutely nuts. And all of a sudden a blight hits. And the blight was such that it's a fungus. Yeah, I think it's a fungus. It's a little white spots you see on the coffee plant. And what happens, it doesn't kill the coffee plant, but it makes the seeds really bitter. So all of a sudden you can't use the coffee. The coffee tastes like crap. I don't know how else to describe it. I tried it once just out of too much curiosity. It was absolutely horrible. So the plant still grows, but all of a sudden it's now useless economically. It's really sort of a poetic justice thing, I guess. And the end result is this entire coffee investment just went tunk. It just disappeared, literally overnight. And tons of people went bankrupt, and especially these Kamainak boys. They took it on the chin because a lot of this was sort of their idea. Now, ironically, the only place it survived was over here on the Big Island. Because what happened is the coffee they were planting up here was high enough elevation. Ironically, the blight doesn't go above, I think it's 800 feet. I don't know if you'd ask them, all the farmers. I know friends of mine have coffee plantations. In fact, my aunt and sister has a plantation. But the coffee above a certain elevation, pretty much here actually. I'm not sure what elevation is. That's oops. What elevation are we here? Go and give me elevation, folks. It's not giving me an elevation. Coffee up here doesn't have the blight. And so what happened is this section, which became called Kona, which it actually isn't, it's actually what's part of South Kona. This area here was able to keep growing coffee. And this, of course, becomes the Kona coffee that this area is famous for. The rest of the islands actually was all growing coffee, but it was wiped out by the blight. In the last 15, 20 years, they finally came up with a way to get rid of the blight. And now you can grow coffee pretty much wherever you want to, which is why you now find Kau coffee, you find Kauai coffee, et cetera, et cetera. But this area up here, by virtue of elevation, became the last place the coffee was left. Now, the guys that had property up here did really well. Everyone else took it on the chin. So the coffee was a classic example of one of these ways whose entire purpose was to make money. Once the money is not being made, then you just dump it like a hot potato. Pineapple was, of course, the third big one that comes in. The problem with pineapple is you're competing with sugar. It's in the same land. So some families got into coffee, stayed in sugar. Other families switched over to pineapple. Castle and Cook switched a lot of their property to pineapple. That's actually Dole, which is originally part of Castle and Cook. And so what you get is the pineapple becomes your other one of these. Now, the thing that all three have in common is one is they take up a lot of property. So you have to be one of these, big five folks that actually has tons of property. Secondly, is they require really cheap labor. They're all very labor intensive. Sugar, especially pineapple, probably the most spectacularly. But all three of these require that you have large amounts of bodies out there picking it. And if you go into Kona or anywhere in the Big Island where people are growing coffee, my sister, for example, she still has to hire picking crews that largely come in from Guatemala, who come here on 3-month, visas and pick everyone's coffee, then go home. So, it's a very labor intensive industry where you literally pick the coffee by hand. You used to cut and burn and etc. the sugar by hand. And of course, you used to pick pineapple by hand and then process it by hand. So all these industries required an enormous amount of physical labor. So they required lots of people, and they had to be done really cheap if you were going to make any money off of this. Now, in this entire system, since all your revenue is being generated by this very small group of people, what happens with all this is because these same people run large parts of the government, is very quickly the monarchy instead of the chiefs, in the sense of the chiefs that run the government, become pretty much irrelevant. Because on one hand, they're running the government, but they're not in charge of the finances. They're not in charge of the legal system. That's now held by the missionary boys, essentially. So the last chunk of the monarchy, pretty much if you want to, from Kamehameha V through Kalakaua and Liliuokalani, the monarchy's around, but it's no longer the force that runs the country. The force that runs the Hawaiian nation by the late 1860s and through up to 1893 is basically these guys, because they're the ones generating all the money. And if you're the government, you need money. So you can't piss these guys off, or else they'll just, move their investments out of somewheres or whatever, and you're going to be out of luck. So what you find is the government's not in a situation where it really controls its own world. These enormous landowners control the world, and the government's sort of at their mercy, for all intents and purposes. Now, not surprisingly, when this shift happens, this is when you start to see what we call toponymy. This is where you start to see a renaming of the landscape. So you start to see a lot of areas get renamed. Sometimes they use Hawaiian words. So, for example, the Kaimuki Land Company built investments and built subdivisions in Wilhelmina Rise, and they decided to call that section Kaimuki. So sometimes you'll use Hawaiian words, but they're in different ways. The Captain Cook area was never technically part of Kona. It was never called that way, but it ends up being called that way because of the coffee production. So in some cases, you're using terms from an area. In other cases, you actually change the words to Western words. Most famous would probably be the shift from Leahi to Diamond Head. The other would be the shift to Salt Lake. So what you get is you get a Western naming on the landscape that's largely driven by the fact that the people that own the landscape and run the landscape are these part Hawaiian, but for all intents and purposes in a mental and sort of social way, are a bunch of New England folks, and that's your missionary boys. And they're the power brokers right through the territorial period, right into basically the 1960s. The missionary boys and their kids and grandkids and great-grandkids are the political, social, economic force in the Hawaiian Islands. And in some ways, they still are, as we'll see later. So what this means is by, say, 1865, 1870, we're in a situation where the private sector controls the country. The government is at the mercy, if you would, of the private sector. The governmental sector is very much the second player. And what you find is some interesting things that are done specifically on the landscape. Kalakaua, being the monarch for much of this period, was very aware of the situation, didn't like it, wanted to bring back the monarchy, was very concerned about what was happening to the Makainana. And he comes up with a fascinating set of strategies in terms of manipulating the Hawaiian landscape to take advantage of what little the monarchy has that still belongs to it. One of the most intriguing that gets very little play outside of Lanai, and I'm not sure why it doesn't get more notice, is by the 1840s period, Lanai was basically depopulated. It had been pretty much, the population had been wiped out in the 1770s by Colonial Pu'u, when he was pissed off and just sort of genocided the population on the island. People were living on there, but they weren't really tied to the land particularly, and oftentimes there are folks from Molokai that would just go over there and raise animals or whatever. So there's very few people, probably less than 50 people on the island in the 1860s, 1870s. There's this really odd guy named Gibson who comes over. He's originally a Mormon missionary, another missionary, comes over here, very quickly becomes sort of embedded in the Hawaiian community, very quickly becomes real sort of like best buds with Kalakaua. And he comes up with this scheme to basically do two things. One is to give the Makainana land again, and do this in a particularly non-Calvinist, non-missionary boy way. And the second is to, of course, not surprisingly, put himself in a position of a sort of almost a traditional chief. So he talks Kalakaua into basically giving him the island of Lanai, giving him almost all the property in the island, and turning that into a Hawaiian sort of sanctuary. I don't know how to describe it. The word escapes me right now. So what he does, he takes a bunch of folks over from Honolulu, Laie, and other folks. Though he's Mormon, by this time he's not really, the Mormons have disavowed him or thrown him out, or I can't remember what you call it, excommunicated, I think it is. So he's not actually part of the Mormon group here. But he gets a bunch of folks to follow him, all Hawaiians, to follow him over to Lanai, and they set up a combination of what's supposed to be a ranch and some farms and stuff like that under him. it's real interesting when you read the accounts of this period, because most of your press was, of course, run by folks who were related to the missionary families. Hang on, I got a chat here. Oh, okay. So what you get is the missionary families are not fans of this, not surprisingly. So they very quickly come up with this sort of dirty public relations campaign to diss on his parade, argue that he's turned this into like a free love, very 1960s, you know, sort of cult type situation. It's really hard now because we don't have much from Gibson himself. It's really hard now to figure out just exactly what was going on. But eventually what happens is the project fails. Most of the folks give up and go back to Oahu or move to Molokai. But it was sort of interesting because this was an intentional movement on the part of Kalakaua to recolonize rural areas with Hawaiians, to get them back on the land and get them out of sort of this idea of Western failure, which was the way they're starting to sort of see themselves. And they were failures in the Western sense. And that's certainly how the missionary boys were playing them as. He also comes up with the idea that since the Hawaiian population is shrinking, and you've got these heavy recruitment of Asians to work as laborers on these various projects, sugar, pineapple, coffee, that what he's going to do is he's going to give Asians the vote, but he's going to encourage them to get the vote by marrying Hawaiians. So he actually starts up a government policy where if you're Chinese or Japanese, you marry someone who's part Hawaiian, you actually automatically become a citizen of the state. And so this is his way to basically increase the political power base of the Hawaiian state by merging in other populations. Now to the Hawaiians, this is perfectly fine because again, the Hawaiian system was not one that was racially defined and it wasn't socio-biological in that sense. So if you got some Chinese boy who's a hard worker and he's willing to marry into the family, fine. Just, you know, hanai him right in, boom, he's part of the family. Of course, again, to the missionary boys, who ironically are Hapa, because you have to remember they're part Hawaiian, they just go absolutely berserk at all this. They say, oh, you know, you're diluting Hawaiians by bringing in Asians, blah, 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 blah. So this becomes yet another way to sort of diss on the whole monarchy one and the idea of the sort of commoner Hawaiian on the other. But then this is also where you get this whole issue of blood quantum. How Hawaiian are you by virtue of the amount of blood Hawaiian you are versus Hawaiian as being part of the system. And Kalakaua's view, Hawaiian was something that was tied to loyalty, family relationships, etc. To the Kama'aina, to the missionary boys, they very quickly defined Hawaiian as being a percentage of blood because they wanted to limit this process. So it was a very calculated political move to get this idea of blood quantum, not because you were concerned about diffusion of Hawaiian culture or Hawaiians at all. You just wanted to limit the number of people who are going to be available as Hawaiians. He also starts up a process. We certainly see this in my area in East Maui. He starts the Hawaiian homesteads, very much like homestead in the U.S. mainland. In fact, he took the law from the U.S. one. So what he does is he sets it up so that if you're Hawaiian and you move into a rural area where there's no one on the land, and no one owns the land, so it's government land. This would include, for example, all of Kahiki Nui, almost all of East Maui, outside of Hana. What you do is you stake out your property. You can get either 10 acres for a farm or 100 acres for a ranch. So you go and you measure out, you put up stakes and you put up a fence or whatever, and then you work it. You have 3 years to work the land. At the end of the 3 years, you have to pay, I believe it's like $25 or $50 to the government. And at that point, they give you the deed for the land. So this was the Hawaiian Homestead Project, and it's actually pretty successful in some areas. Up in Waialua and places like that, it was pretty successful in Oahu. East Maui, we have family out there in Kahiki Nui who acquired property during the homesteads. So depending on where you were, it worked. But a lot of families had a really hard time because if you're a city person, you suddenly find yourself being a rancher or a farmer, you know, especially in areas like that that are really marginal. You really have to bust ass to make it happen. And in many cases, they didn't have the experience. They didn't know what they were doing. And so they just like their mainland counterparts, the vast majority of homesteaders in Alaska fail for exactly the same reasons. It's despite you being, you know, despite checking it up on YouTube, it ain't fun. It's hard work. So it did work in some places. Ironically, if they did have success in homesteading, this is certainly true in East Maui, what would then happen is the large ranches or the large agricultural, in other words, the missionary boys would come in and actually take over, adverse possess the property because they realized they could make money off of it. So in many cases, you get some poor family who go out there, bust ass, actually make a go of it, make a ranch, then all of a sudden find all the area around them swallowed up by one of the larger families, one of these missionary families, and then boom, they take over the property. This happened a lot in East Maui. The Halakala Ranch and Ulapalakua Ranch were both pretty famous for this. So, you know, this was also really famous apparently on the Big Island. The Parkers were doing this. I don't know too many folks out there. So this was a strategy of the monarchy. This isn't the Hawaiian homes thing of the 20th century. This is homesteading run by the government. It's oftentimes in the same places, but it's an entirely different program. Real interesting to see, could have been much more successful if the government had more control over the economic and the legal system than it actually did. The government actually tried really hard to push people back into rural areas. That was one reason for the homesteads. Kalakaua was convinced on one hand that Hawaiians living in urban areas were always going to be disadvantaged. They weren't going to get as good education, they wouldn't get paid as much, especially with Asians coming up. They had multiple areas of labor competition, etc. He was also firmly convinced that the Hawaiian sense of the land, the Hawaiian relationship with Aina, was such that you couldn't do that in a modern urban situation like, say, Lahaina or Honolulu or something. You had to do it in rural areas. So he put a lot of measures in place like tax reduction and stuff. If you would move to Hana, Waianae, Makaha, for example, Milili'i on the Big Island, or Naalehu, to encourage populations to move back in the rural areas to both find themselves again, if you want to think of it that way, but also provide the government with a power base that was outside of the Kama'aina missionary boy land holdings. All these strategies fail. The population is still decreasing. People can't understand, you know, even today, if you suddenly had that today, most people wouldn't do it because, you know, moving to someplace like Milili'i, I mean, I like Milili'i, but on the other hand, if you're from Honolulu or Hilo or something like that, and you like your Wi-Fi, and you like all the rest of that stuff, you ain't gonna have that stuff in Milili'i. So what seems like a good idea for a week vacation getaway is a whole nother thing when it becomes your entire life. And so all of these pretty much just fall apart. They were well-intended in another place and time that might have been more successful. But given the fact that you have this huge entree of population coming in from Asian areas recruited as labor and everything else going on, not to mention this increasing relationship with the United States, whereas California and especially San Francisco had needed Hawaii, and so it was pretty much a give and take relationship. By the 1880s, it was pretty much California was in control, and it's almost like buying food from Zippy's. You place an order. So Hawaii, rather than being the counterpart, now becomes the stepchild. And so very much the United States now runs the Hawaiian system, if you would, not directly, but economically. The investment money's coming out of San Francisco, the main orders where your markets are in California. So they pretty much tell Hawaii hop and Hawaii hops. So in all this situation, the monarchy doesn't have control. Now, the interesting thing is what the missionary boys didn't realize is they didn't have control either. I think they thought they did because they were running the legal system, they were running the economic system, they had these nice California markets all tied up, they had their investment money in California and vice versa. So I think they thought they knew how the game was being played. And they're the ones that trigger the overthrow. The missionary boys triggered the overthrow because the United States government, we changed presidents. The new president coming in, very much like Trump, was anti-outside money. So he was under, pressure, but also just his political stance was such that Americans should eat American food and Americans should buy American products. So in that situation, since Hawaii is an independent country, he doesn't see that Americans should eat Hawaiian sugar. He doesn't see that Americans should eat Hawaiian pineapples. They can get pineapples and sugar from Florida, for example. So, screw Hawaii. So they shut Hawaii off as a market. And in a panic, the missionary boys suddenly realized that their market stopped. The investment money stopped, and they're going to go bankrupt literally within about a year or so. So they overthrow the monarchy, ironically, not because of political reasons, not for moral, ethical, fear of Hawaiian resurgence or anything like that. They literally do it because they're worried about their paycheck. A rather sad reason to overthrow a government, but that's it. And they think that they're going to get the United States to jump on board and take over Hawaii as a territory, at which point then, of course, they will have access to the American markets because now they're part of the American system. Ironically, the government's just changed. Cleveland comes in, the new president, and he's horrified that the United States, by virtue of sending military troops to actually make the overthrow happen, was implicated in the overthrow of a friendly government that the United States had just signed a mutual defense treaty with. So he says, no, we're not going to come and take Hawaii. That's ridiculous. You know, we don't want to have anything to do with it. So the missionary boys who triggered this suddenly find themselves in an even worse situation. Now they don't have the monarchy. They still don't have their American markets. And now what do? And that sets the stage for the republic. So for the next 5 years, we're a republic. We're still an independent country under control of the monarchy families, or I should say missionary families, who basically take monarchy law and use about all of it. So they change almost nothing. The only difference is now legal colonies under house arrest, and you've got a provisional government under Stanford Dole. But other than that, everything's the same business as usual, because it never occurred to them they were going to have run a country. They thought they'd just give the United States this little package. The United States would take us as a territory. 1898, 1899, the United States is getting very colonial. We basically take Cuba from the Spanish, along with Puerto Rico, on the Philippines, and in that process also then pretty much come to the Republic and tell them, hey, by the way, we're going to take you guys over too, which is what you wanted. Now, the interesting thing is by 1898, 1899, the missionary boys had gotten sort of comfortable having a republic. And there was not a lot of popular support to become part of the United States and become a territory in 1898, unlike 1893. So one of the ironies is when we eventually become a territory, even the guys that had wanted it to happen are a lot more unhappy about it, but they just don't know what to do about it because the United States is the 800-pound gorilla in your front yard. So the United States takes over and annexes Hawaii. And we become part of the United States in 1899. Now, what the missionary boys had apparently dawned on them is that if you're an independent country, so if it's 1896 or 1866, that means that you generate your own laws, you generate your tax system, you generate stuff. Of course, they had been in charge of all that stuff since the 1860s. So they were running everything. There was no oversight. They were the oversight. If you suddenly become part of the United States in 1899, and those of you from Guam or American Samoa are very familiar with this, now you're just a territory. Your governor is actually appointed by U.S. Congress. The locals might vote for him, but then it goes to Congress, and I think it's the Senate actually approves the governor. So that you don't even decide on your own management. You're entirely at the mercy of the U.S. Congress and the President of the United States. And you basically have no say, because if you're a territory, you do not vote in Congress. So American Samoa and Guam, they have folks sitting in Congress, but for all intents and purposes, they're just like interns. They have no votes. So if I'm McConnell or Pelosi or something like that, I don't give a rat's ass about American Samoa and Guam or Puerto Rico, because they're not going to vote. So therefore, why should I waste my time listening to them? Why should I do them any favors? So all of a sudden, the missionary boys went from being the big guppy in a little bowl to being a little tiny guppy in an ocean. And they didn't like it. They didn't know what to do about it. And they never really figured out what to do about it. So all of a sudden, by 1899, if you went to 1900, Hawaii finds itself as one of a number of territories that basically is entirely at the mercy of whatever the United States decides to do. And at that moment, all of a sudden, we fall under U.S. law. The cost of running government just goes up exponentially, as we'll see. And especially the relationship that people have with land changes, because monarchy law is very clear that certain things like water are inalienable public rights, that beaches and nearshore fishing are inalienable public rights. So individuals can't own them. Under US law, you can control a beach. Under US law, you can control water. You can control the water in a stream under US law. So the US legal system is radically different than what monarchy law, which is what we had till 1899. And this has caused an enormous amount of trouble ever since then, right down till today. On top of that, because we're only a territory, you have American law, but it's not applied equitably. It's not applied all the time because we're so far away. And oftentimes, for example, the US Supreme Court wouldn't hear territorial cases because they couldn't use them for precedent. They weren't a state. So this whole place sort of goes patonk. And to a certain extent falls off the edge of the planet. with the exception of two things. One is military, because of military, the US strategic sense of what Hawaii is to the United States. The secondly is tourism. And these two forces still run Hawaii right now in 2020. The military is right now the biggest expender of resources in the state of Hawaii, especially with tourism gone. And the mantra you hear every day in the news is that tourism has to come back or our economy is going to go under. This was exactly the same discussion in 1910, 1930, 1950, 1980. So what you get in this is that becomes one of the key factors. The other key factor is all of a sudden the entire population here falls under the United States logic. And the United States logic right into the I'd say 1990s, but actually sad to say maybe even 2020, is very much a white man's logic. The United States is seen very much as an Anglo situation in an Anglo society. To an extent, if you're one of the other groups, if you look different, sound different, whatever, then you're supposed to want to be like Anglos. This is the classic melting pot argument that you see on like the Statue of Liberty. You come from someone else, you're thrown in the pot, you lose whatever you were, and you melt and become this new thing called American. But of course, the reality of American society by the 1830s, it was stunningly racist. Now, the monarchy had racism, but it was always something that it wasn't really that comfortable with, and all the parties involved were generally they were HAPA. So they were never going to get really big on the whole racial thing because, it was being in a glass house type thing. When we become part of the United States, one of the problems you get into, and this is so symptomatic of the whole thing, is when we become part of the United States, you can't get teachers from the US mainland to come and teach in Hawaii. And the reason very simply is the majority of the population here ain't white, and the majority of teachers were white. And they didn't want to teach a bunch of non-white kids. So that's the reality of being part of the United States. You suddenly find yourself as a non-white enclave that the rest of the United States, not only, since you're a territory, they don't care about you in the first place. And secondly, as they see you as being reflective of something they're not at all find attractive, which is a non-white majority area. And we're still a non-white majority state. We're the only one in the United States. So we're never going to be part of the mainland, and the mainland makes that very clear. And this is still why much of the mainland people are surprised when they find Hawaii as a state. If you're from here and you go to the mainland, you'll still find people ask you, do you need a passport? Do you guys use American money? Well, I use that list. I don't know, my debit card, will my debit card work in Hawaii? That type of thing. Really pretty sad, given that's 2020. In this entire context, the only group that's not seen in a negative is the idealized Hawaiian. If one thing, I call this the Disney Hawaiian. Now, ironically, to a certain extent, this would include the Kamehameha statue on King Street in front of the Judiciary Building. More importantly, this would include the Duke Kahanamoku statue in Waikiki. So what you have is this image of the Hawaiian. That can either be the Kam Hawaiian, the powerful ruler of the country that makes the country, and da-da-da-da-da. So it becomes this very strong stereotype, and I'm not sure what tourists and other folks think of Kamehameha, but the statue sort of reflects that whole sort of view, though the statue is actually sponsored by the monarchy. The Duke Kahanamoku statue is even more explicitly part of this stereotype. The warm, friendly, embracing Hawaiian that just happens to have a statue plopped right down the middle of Waikiki. And part of this is because the stereotype of Hawaiians was sort of two Hawaiians. There were the Hawaiians who were living in the 19th and 20th century, the Hawaiians that are around today. Those are the ones that get the negative stereotypes. Working in Hawaiian time, lazy, da-da-da, the list goes on and on. Just that sad set of stereotypes that Tengen talks about in his book. On the other hand, you have the stereotype of the Hawaiians as being these children of the Garden of Eden. Remember the original part at the beginning of the semester. So Hawaiians are seen as a population which has a very peculiar, very idealized place in the American stereotypes of places. In the same way that see the same thing in the mainland if you go to the Southwest with my friends who are Navajo or Hopi, or I should say Diné or Hopi. They are who they are. But the tourists and even oftentimes the federal and state governments see them as sort of like you're the partial children of the really famous Indians. So there's a whole set of stereotypes, very positive stereotypes about the dead Indians or the imaginary Indians. Pretty negative stereotypes about the living Indians. See the same thing here. There's very positive stereotypes about aspects of Hawaiian. They're not necessarily particularly closely tied to folks who actually are Hawaiian. And so what you get is in this whole discussion then of Hawaiians. And because by the 20th century, by the time we become part of the United States, the number of folks who are identifying themselves as Hawaiian, not necessarily Hawaiian by culture, but are willing to be identified as that. Because you have to remember, by now you already have Hawaiians not being allowed. You can't use Hawaiian in the legal situation. Under the Republic, you can't give testimony, for example, in Hawaiian, in the court system. Under the territory, English is the only language taught in schools. So you're trying to get Hawaiian out. On the other hand, because of this racial attitude, you have a very strong sense of the people who are Hawaiian as being an endangered species. So you actually see articles, there will be no longer any children of Kamehameha left by 1920 or 1930, whatever number they're making up. So you get this idea of the Hawaiians as an endangered species. And again, this is the classic racial argument that you do it on blood quantum. So I'll sort of stop with that, but you still see some of this discussion going on today. Okay, is that fairly clear? We exist in a very strange place. I don't know too many other, there's a lot of places where you have stereotypes of place. I don't know too many other places that have such a strong stereotype about one group of people who lives in that place. But if you're from here, if you think about it for a second, this is why there's almost no stereotypes about locals, and especially on the mainland. If any of you are Hawaiian or you're identified as Hawaiian or you're even from Hawaii, you go to the mainland, say to mainland university for a semester, you'll find that everyone has a set of stereotypes about Hawaiians. If you say, oh no, I'm local, they'll just look at you blankly. Like what the hell does that mean? And that's sort of peculiar to us. It's, as far as I know, pretty peculiar to Hawaii. It has to do with this view of Hawaiians. Now, of course, this is, the basis of the tourism industry, as we'll see. The tourism industry markets Hawaiian. The tourism industry doesn't market local. So we'll see this, going through almost all the rest of the semester. But we sort of bumped into it now. Okay, so it doesn't look like there's any questions. I see one thumb up. So we'll assume that everyone's sort of going like, yeah, okay, whatever. If that's the case,